House of Seekers, Episode 4. How Banks Control the Entire World. Sounds a little out there, doesn't it?
Right.
Like full-on conspiracy theory.
Yeah, you hear that title and you think shadowy figures and secret meetings and all that.
Right.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
It's not about any of that. It's about math. Like the actual structure of how our financial system works.
Okay, so no secret societies or anything.
Nope, just numbers. And how they've led to a crazy concentration of power in the hands of, well, banks.
Okay, I am intrigued. So where does this control even start? What's the root of it all?
Interest rates. Simple as that.
Interest rates. But those are like normal, right? I mean, anyone who's taken out a loan, a car loan, mortgage, you name it, has dealt with interest.
Right. It's everywhere. And that's exactly the problem, because the way the interest-based system is set up, it creates this weird paradox.
A paradox. How so?
Think about it. Every time a bank lends money, they expect to get more back, right? That's the interest.
Yeah, that's how it works.
But if every borrower has to pay back more than they borrowed, where's all that extra money coming from?
I never thought of it that way.
It's not like it just appears out of thin air. This extra money has to come from somewhere.
So for someone to win in this system, someone else has to lose.
Exactly. What we're talking about is a constant built-in transfer of wealth. And it's not based on people making things or providing services. It's just lending and borrowing. That's the engine of the whole thing.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see where you're going with this. But hold on. What about economic growth? Don't we create more wealth as time goes on, more money to go around? Shouldn't that balance things out?
We do create more wealth, yes. But there's a catch, a big one.
Which is?
The rate at which we create new wealth, the GDP growth, it's almost always slower than the interest rates on those loans. So even with the economy growing, there's still a gap.
Between what we owe and what actually exists.
Exactly. And that gap, it has to be filled somehow.
How do we fill it? By creating more debt.
You got it. It's a cycle. The system demands more and more debt just to function. And the more debt there is, the more people are stuck in the system, dependent on it. We call this market saturation.
Market saturation. So even if things look like they're booming on the surface, underneath, it's all just built on a mountain of debt.
Pretty much. And here's where things get really, really interesting. Because this system can't survive without constant growth. That's the fuel.
Endless growth. But isn't there a limit to how much we can grow peacefully, so to speak?
There is. And that's where history gives us a pretty clear and pretty disturbing answer for how to inject more growth into the system.
I have a bad feeling about where this is going.
War.
War. But how does war, which is destructive, benefit a system built on money and finance? That doesn't make sense.
Think of it this way. When a war happens, especially a big one, it destroys a whole lot of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Buildings, infrastructure, sometimes entire economies are wiped out.
Yeah, that's kind of the definition of war.
But destruction creates demand.
Demand for what?
To rebuild everything that's been destroyed. And how do you rebuild? With money, with loans. War becomes, in this twisted way, a business opportunity.
So it's a reset button. Destroy everything and then start over, but with a whole lot more debt.
It's more than that, though. War also forces open markets that might have been closed before. Suddenly, countries need help, they need resources, and they need loans.
It creates a power vacuum that can be filled by those who control the money.
Exactly. And then there's the direct seizure of resources. Oil fields, valuable minerals, strategic locations. War gives a reason to take control of all that stuff. And who benefits? The people who finance the conflict in the first place.
This is a lot to take in. So the system demands endless growth. Peaceful growth isn't enough. And war becomes the way to keep the engine running.
That's the basic idea. But to really understand how we got here, we need to look at how this system, this concentration of power in the hands of banks, how it evolved over time.
Okay, so from local banks to global domination, how did that happen?
It's like the interest itself, compounding over generations. The first generation focused on the basics, accumulating wealth. They collected tourists, took over assets when people couldn't pay, started getting involved in local politics. It was all about laying the foundation.
Makes sense. So what happened next?
Things got more sophisticated. The second generation, they figured out how to really control the game. They set up central banks, created this thing called fractional reserve banking, which basically lets them create money out of thin air.
They could just make more money.
Pretty much. It's more complicated than that, but that's the gist. And once they controlled the money supply, their power became, well, almost unstoppable.
Wow. So by this point, it's not just about lending money anymore. They control the whole system.
Right. And then comes the third generation. Their goal is to reshape society itself. They influence education, media, the laws we live under. They change how we see the world.
That's a whole other level.
Yeah.
But how do they actually do that? What are their tools?
They create dependence. They make you need them to survive.
Mhm.
Look at home prices. Look at student loans. Look at the debt farmers are struggling with. It's everywhere.
So it's not just individuals, it's entire industries trapped in this web of debt.
Exactly. And then you have these massive companies like BlackRock. They control trillions of dollars, and they use that power to influence everything. They can force companies to adopt certain policies, promote certain ideas, just by threatening to pull their money.
So our culture, the things we believe in, even that's being shaped by this financial system.
To a large extent, yes.
It's a lot to process.
It is, and we're just scratching the surface. It's designed to funnel wealth upwards. Take it from the people who actually make things, provide services, and give it to, well, you know who.
Yeah, I'm starting to get the picture. But let's talk about the impact. Like, how is this actually playing out in the real world? What are the consequences?
The numbers are pretty scary. Global debt is something like $300 trillion.
300 trillion. That's just an insane amount of money.
It is. It's more than 3 times the entire global GDP. Like, we owe 3 times more than we produce in a year.
That just doesn't seem possible. How can we owe that much?
That's the thing about debt. It keeps growing. And the interest payments on all that debt, it's actually eating up more wealth than we're creating.
So we're not even treading water anymore. We're sinking.
Basically. And the consequences are everywhere you look. Take housing, for example. The average house now costs, what, 8, maybe 10 times the average person's income?
Yeah, it's crazy. Owning a home seems impossible for most people these days.
It is. And you know what that means. It means more and more people are stuck renting. Who are they renting from? The same institutions that control the financial system.
So they profit either way. You're either buying a house with their money or renting from them.
Exactly. And it's not just housing. Look at what's happening to farmers.
There are a lot of stories about farmers struggling these days. How does all of this tie into that?
85%.
85% of what?
85% of American farmers are in debt. They have to borrow money just to plant their crops.
So the people who feed us are drowning in debt. Doesn't seem like a very sustainable system.
It's not. And it's pushing family farms out of business. They can't compete with these giant corporate mega farms.
Which I'm guessing are also heavily financed by the same system.
You got it. It's consolidation of power. Less competition, more control.
And meanwhile, the middle class is shrinking.
Wages are stagnant, savings are depleted, retirement funds are shaky. People are working 2-3 jobs just to get by.
The American dream is dying.
It is. And on top of all that, you've got this endless war machine.
Right. It's like we're always at war somewhere. But how does that fit into all of this?
War is expensive, creates a lot of debt. Who lends the money for these wars?
The banks.
And who profits from rebuilding after the war?
The same banks. It's a cycle.
A very profitable one. And it doesn't even touch on the environmental impact.
Right. We're destroying the planet in the name of endless economic growth.
Which is needed to keep this whole debt-fueled system going. It's a mess. A mathematical crisis, a social crisis, a geopolitical crisis, and an environmental crisis, all rolled into one.
It feels pretty hopeless. Is there any way out of this? Are there any alternatives to this system that seem, well, destined to collapse?
There are alternatives, but here's the thing. The people who benefit from this system, they're not going to give up their power easily. They're digging in, trying to make it even harder to escape.
What do you mean? What are they doing?
Think negative interest rates. Central banks creating money like it's going out of style. Financial manipulation is becoming more and more blatant.
It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion.
And the control is getting tighter. Digital currencies, social credit systems, they're closing the net.
So while we're trying to find a way out, they're making the walls higher. It's a pretty daunting challenge. But okay, let's talk about those alternatives. What are some of the options? Where do we even start? Last time we were talking about how those in power, they're not exactly going to make it easy for us to ditch this broken system. They're fighting to hold on, even if it means taking us all down with them. But let's talk about solutions. Let's get a little optimistic here. What are some of the alternatives to this whole debt-based mess?
Well, there are a few paths we can explore. Some of them we can actually look back in history for inspiration. Others, well, they're brand new, coming out of all these technological innovations we're seeing.
Okay, I like the sound of that. So looking back, what's something that worked before, a system that maybe we could learn from?
The gold standard.
Ah, the gold standard. I've heard that term, but I'll be honest, I don't really know how it worked. Bring it down for me.
Sure. Basically, it means that your currency, your dollars, whatever, they're directly tied to a specific amount of actual gold.
So like I could take my dollar bills to the bank and say, give me the gold this represents.
Theoretically, yes. That's what gave money real value. It wasn't just a promise like our current system.
Okay, I'm following.
Yeah.
But why did we move away from the gold standard if it was working?
There were a few reasons. It limited how much governments could spend, which could be a problem during, say, a war, or if you wanted to build a bunch of new roads or bridges.
So less flexibility.
Yeah, and it made it harder to manage the ups and downs of the economy. But the biggest reason, I think, is that it took away power from those who wanted to control the money supply.
The banks.
The banks, the governments, they couldn't just print more money whenever they felt like it. They needed to have the gold to back it up.
So we traded stability and sound money for what? The ability to manipulate the system.
Pretty much. It allowed for all this crazy debt expansion, which has been great for some people, but now we're seeing the bill come due.
Right. Okay, so the gold standard, it's something to think about. But what about systems that are actually working today? Anything out there that operates outside of this interest-based model?
There's Islamic banking. At least in principle, it offers a different way of doing things.
Islamic banking. Tell me more.
It's based on Islamic law, which forbids charging interest. It's all about sharing profits and risks.
So instead of lending money at a fixed rate, you invest in a project and share in the outcome, whatever that might be.
Exactly. But in practice, it's not always that simple. A lot of these so-called Islamic banks, they've figured out ways to get around the rules, to basically do the same things as regular banks, but just call it something different.
So it's kind of like a loophole.
Yeah, you could say that. It's hard to completely escape the interest-based system when it's so deeply embedded in everything.
Okay, what about cryptocurrencies? Those seem to be getting a lot of attention as a potential solution. What's your take on them?
They're interesting. Cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, they offer some real possibilities. They're outside the control of governments and central banks. There's a fixed supply, so you can't just print more. And they're decentralized, which makes them harder to manipulate.
So they could offer a way to break free from this whole debt-based system.
They could, but they have their downsides too. The value can swing wildly, which makes them risky. Transactions can be slow, and some of them use a lot of energy, which isn't great for the environment.
So not perfect, but a step in the right direction, maybe.
Possibly. It's an experiment, and it's definitely shaking things up.
Okay, so we've talked about the gold standard, Islamic banking, cryptocurrencies. Anything else worth exploring?
There are a bunch of smaller systems, what we call alternative credit systems. They operate on a more local level within communities or specific industries.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Community banks. They're owned and operated by people in the community, so they tend to focus on lending to local businesses and individuals. They understand the needs of the area better than some big national bank.
That makes sense.
Then you have mutual credit systems. It's like people creating their own credit by just trading with each other without needing a bank or interest charges.
Interesting.
And then there are public banks. These are banks that are owned by the government, so they're not driven by profit. They can focus on things that benefit the public good, like infrastructure projects or affordable housing.
So all of these systems, they're about taking power away from the big banks and giving it back to people, to communities.
Exactly. It's about democratizing finance, making it work for everyone, not just a select few.
I like that. So out of all these options, is there one that you think holds the most promise? The one that could really create a system that's fair and sustainable?
To me, the best solution is probably a combination of the old and the new. Take the best parts of traditional systems, like the stability of gold, and combine them with modern technology.
Then what would that look like?
Imagine a digital currency, something like Bitcoin but backed by gold. Every digital unit is tied to a specific amount of physical gold held in reserve.
So we'd have the benefits of a digital system, the speed, the transparency, but with the stability of gold backing it up.
Right. And you could use blockchain technology to decentralize it so no one entity has control. It would be a truly global system built on trust and transparency.
That sounds amazing. But how do we get from where we are now, drowning in debt and facing all these crises, to that? It seems like such a huge leap.
It's not going to be easy. It's going to require a change in how we think about money, about value, about the role of finance in our lives. We have to reject this idea that debt is inevitable, that endless growth is the only answer.
So it's not just about finding the right technical solution. It's about a shift in consciousness. A recognition that the system we're living under is not just broken, it's fundamentally wrong.
Exactly. The future of finance isn't set in stone. We have the power to choose a different path, to create a system that works for everyone. But it's going to take courage, imagination, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Well said. We need to start asking the hard questions, exploring these alternatives, demanding better. And that's all the time we have for this episode of House of Seekers. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep seeking the truth.